Hello, I'm Oddrun Zuber-Skerrit, the editor of a series of monographs on Australian playwrights, and the producer of this series of video programs in which you will see and hear the playwrights themselves speak about their work. I'm sure it will make your study of Australian drama much more interesting if you can see the playwrights, hear them speak, and learn from them personally about their thoughts, views, and feelings. I think that these video programs will help you better understand and appreciate the author's work and analyze and interpret their writings. Each video program is designed to supplement the written monograph. If you do not have these books, they may be obtained from this address. This is the fourth video program in the series entitled Australian Playwrights Speak. The playwright is David Williamson from Melbourne, and the interviewer is Dr. Peter Fitzpatrick, Senior Lecturer in the English Department at Monash University in Melbourne.
David, to begin with, could you tell us a little about how you came to begin writing for the theatre?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer, even in the very early days, but I always thought in terms of writing novels. And I wrote in my teens and later filled books full of bad prose. But it wasn't until I got to university and actually started writing scripts for engineers' reviews and university reviews that I started to feel the excitement of that immediate communication between what you'd written, the actors performing it, and the reaction of the audience. And I also saw some very exciting student plays of contemporary overseas work at the time, which really made me excited about theatre, and I thought I'll write for that. Then I was fortunate enough to be there when the small theatres around Carlton were springing up, or in particular the Mama, whose policy was, under Betty Birstall, to look for specifically Australian work. And that work was done by actors and directors, a lot of them student actors and directors, who felt that Australian work was almost banned from the larger stages in Australia, which were doing a diet of mainly English and some European plays.
For the last 10 years, I guess you've written, over the last 10 years, you've written as much for film as for the stage. How would you compare the two media to write for?
Well, yes, almost at the time that I started writing for the theatre, one of my early plays called The Coming of Stork was picked up and shot as a very low-budget early Australian film called Stork. So I had almost immediately the experience of writing for both film and stage. I find them very different. I find that all the old cliches are actually true, that stage still is, to me, about actors using language, using it for effect, for subterfuge, and I'm always interested in the way people use language and use it for manipulation and for communication and whatever. Whereas film, as I say, as the cliche goes, is very much about images and images conveying information. So information is conveyed in a different way on film, and the writing, I find, tends to be a lot sparser in terms of dialogue, a lot more concerned with tightness of overall structure. Visuals, yes, you do suggest visuals, but then the director imposes his idea of, and the cinematographer, his idea of what the visuals will be. So you don't feel you're quite as central to the filmmaking process as you do as a stage writer, even though I do feel that the film writer creates the essential structure within which all of the rest happens.
When you were working for the Carlton theatres in the late 60s and early 70s, it was in a very collaborative kind of theatre. Do you find that autonomy as a writer is important to you? Did you resist that sort of thing, and do you find that difficult in film now, to accept heavy direction and tampering with the script?
Very much so, yes. The early plays that were done at La Mama, such as Stork and The Removalists, I didn't have much problem. The cast were committed to realising those scripts, but when I went round the corner to the Pram Factory, which was at the height of its Maoist collective period, where they did a play of mine called Don's Party. I did strike for the first time the conflict between what I'd written and wanted to realise on stage and what they wanted to do. I mean, I turned up and they had cut some of the most effective theatrical passages, and they'd included, well, for instance, 5 minutes of party songs at one stage that weren't in the script, and I felt uneasy in that sort of atmosphere because I suppose I'm authoritarian at heart or base or something. I wrote the script and I wanted that to be realised, which it has by and large on stage, and I've never adapted easily to the situation in film where the director feels that he is the prime creator of the film, or sometimes the producer, and they view you as a resource to be used for their own visions and their own obsessions. So there's always been a bit of conflict and a bit of uneasiness in my work on film.
So I guess that the most potent influences on your writing would probably have come from other writers rather than from specific directors or companies in the end. So
Yes, if there have been influences, for my stage writing, they've come from other writers and observation of the life around me rather than any vision of directors. But I've had very good directors working on my stage plays by and large. I've been lucky.
And you had Rodney Fisher, didn't you, for a number of productions,
I think,
who's obviously in tune with your work.
Well, Rodney's done very good productions of 4 or 5 of my plays, and his intention has been to realise those plays as well as he could.
Yeah. You spoke earlier about playwrights in the 60s when you were becoming interested in theatre. In several places you've talked about Chekhov as your most admired playwright. Could you tell us what things you value in him, and do you feel that his kind of writing is an influence on your kind of writing?
I'd like to think so. I don't think there's a heavy influence, but I certainly always admired the way he could create characters and moods, and his deft manipulation of themes and character. I love plays like Cherry Orchard and Uncle Vanya because of their tonal shifts in mood. Suddenly it's high comedy one moment, and then suddenly it's the depths of tragedy. In Three Sisters, the doctor comes in and says, "I've just been to a plague and half the people in Russia have died," straight after a moment of high farce. And the way that Chekhov can manipulate mood and change so radically from humour to tragedy has always impressed me enormously.
He's a writer who's often thought of as being objective, or at least as cultivating moral ambiguities in his work. I wanted to ask you in relation to your last play, Sons of Cain, which is a much more overtly committed piece of writing. Do you see that as having particular disadvantages for the playwright, or does it have compensating strengths to take a clearly committed point of view, an ideological position, if you like, rather than to remain open to a number of possibilities?
Well, I think it has implications for your characterisation. If you're looking for a piece of high moral ambiguity, you must believe that all the characters in that piece are equally worthy, or you must believe that their unworthiness can be explained in terms of social happenings to them. Nobody is bad in a play of high moral ambiguity. And I think a lot of my plays have displayed that facet. Even in Don's Party, I don't draw a heavy moral line on Cooley. He's a terrible chauvinist, but there are compensating virtues. His human energy and spirit compensates for his thick-skinned chauvinism in some ways. But in Sons of Cain, I suppose I've taken the position that I can't sympathise with a minister of justice who accepts large amounts of money to let drug-related prisoners out of prison, and I can't sympathise with a state premier who tries to cover this behaviour up and allow it to continue. There are limits to the amount of tolerance you can have for characters in your play. I mean, if you're writing, I've had arguments at writers' conferences when they say that the purpose of writing is to show sympathy for all one's characters. And the standard question is, well, how do you deal with a Hitler or a Stalin? Do you really want Do you either limit yourself to writing about situations and characters who are equally worthy and never touch highly charged moral situations, or do you touch those highly charged moral situations and indicate in your writing that you are drawing the line, that some characters are the bad guys and some characters are the good guys? I don't know. If you believe that good writing is always a matter of maximising your moral ambiguity, then you can never deal with real-life situations where there are good guys and bad guys. You have to say President Marcos is explicable in terms of bad toilet training. He's not a bad guy really underneath it all. Or you have to say that Stalin had bad experiences in his youth. But all the evidence shows that Stalin didn't have bad experiences in his youth. He had quite a normal upbringing. He was just a moral monster in some ways. And if you're going to treat Stalin, you can't indulge, I think, in the fantasy that really there's a good man underneath there.
Yeah. Sons of Cain also is peculiar, I guess, in your output as being involved with a specific set of incidents that are happening in contemporary Australian life. Something like Don's Party obviously looks back on very recent Australian history and encapsulates that, but in a sense it's also mythologising that history. I wonder whether with a play like Sons of Cain there is more risk of the play dating. Do you think that its power is in relation to a specific issue, or do you think it's exposing something that is consistently true of political life?
Well, I think it has been consistently true that from the beginning of recorded history, politicians have tended to, or political figures of power have tended to arrogate more and more power as the populace permits them to do so. And I think that possibly the themes of Sons of Cain won't date because that political process of arrogation of power continues. And my point in the play is that although the press is reviled as being sensationalist, inaccurate, escapist, gutter press, there is a function of the press which is to scrutinise the actions of those who hold power in society. It very rarely happens, but when it does happen, it's something that's probably better to be there than not there.
This must be a problem writing a committed position play of this sort in which you want to change your audience's thinking, or at least to influence them in some potent way, because your work has always been marked in other plays by what you've elsewhere called a symbiotic interaction with your audience, a sense of a particular kind of rapport. Have you before Sons of Cain thought of yourself as a political playwright in the sense of wanting to change things, or how do you conceive your relationship with your audience in that play and in the others?
Yeah, I suppose there has been a lot of the detached observer in me, and there still will be in the future. I don't think Sons of Cain marks a change in total direction. It was just that I found myself with a dramatic situation in which, on investigation, I took sides. Yeah. Even in Removalists, I didn't quite take sides. Kenny Carter finally wasn't much better than the two policemen who beat him to death in moral terms. I mean, he was cocky and he was game, but he was also a chauvinist. He was, and that play was about the limitations of those three men. So I still, to some extent, was a detached observer. But I suppose that when you deal with characters who are exercising enormous power over a lot of people, then the moral rules become more stringent. You say, look, we can't excuse Bjelke Peterson because he's cute and he's funny on television, in the same way as you can excuse Cooley for being quaint and chauvinistic, because Cooley doesn't exercise enormous power over a lot of people. Bjelke Peterson does, state premiers do, politicians do. So the moral rules, I think, have to be a little different. And I suppose because I was drawn into that area, because I found drama in it when I talked to Kristen's friends, there was a lot of drama, there was a lot of frustration and anger. Yeah. There was an important issue that, i.e. that the press, although reviled, actually the free press does occasionally perform a vital function to keep that scrutiny on the men of great power. And I did take sides. I said, look, it is just not on that cabinet ministers let out prisoners for money, and it's not on that state premiers turn a blind eye to this sort of activity. I'm not going to be ambivalent here. I'm not going to do a Cooley and say Cooley's quaint and amusing, because these guys actually hold enormous power, and therefore, because they hold power over so many people, there's a correspondingly greater responsibility on them to act in a moral way than there is on a Cooley or a sergeant in the removalist.
Sure. I was reading recently an interview with Louis Nauer in which he said, I feel that you have to shatter people or unsettle them at a very deep level. How do you respond to that notion of interaction with an audience?
No, I don't think that that's the main or sole function of theatre. I think that acute and wry observation, perceptive observation, as Chekhov does, can be very potent in illustrating or explaining or showing us the nature of humanity. I can't be any more specific than that. I mean, when you see a Chekhov play, you are struck with the sadness and the difficulty of human beings trying to obtain emotional satisfaction out of their life. And you realise, after a good production of a Chekhov play, that just the very simple thing of one individual trying to find emotional satisfaction in life is very difficult, very poignant, very touching and moving. And I think that that is a function of the theatre. It's not the only function. But you don't have to go in there and destroy all the preconceptions about humanity, about the political process, to be effective in the theatre. As a hard and fast rule, no, I don't. It can be done and it can be brilliant, but it's not the only function of theatre.
Yeah, it hasn't been the function of yours in most of your writing, has it?
But I felt I had to be, in Sons of Cain, I had to be honest to the base material I was dealing with. I couldn't say the Minister for Justice was cute. He had human failings. He let out a few prisoners for money. I had to draw the moral line because, as I say, that subject matter drew me into a position where I couldn't be as ambivalent as I've been in some of my other plays.
What do you see as the function of the comedy in your earlier plays? Because you mentioned before Bjelke Petersen as a cute character, and I guess when Max Gillies does him, the risk is that he becomes, again, mythologised in a sense. It's like a cartoonist enjoying the warts of his creation and somehow or other making him not only tolerant but almost intolerable but almost endearing. Is there a risk of that, do you think, in some of your earlier work where your ability to be very funny consistently may be at odds with serious social concerns that you might have in those plays?
I suppose in one way, yes, but I defend it in saying, look, Max Gillies doing Bjelke Petersen, there is an endearing side to Bjelke Petersen. It shouldn't be endearing, but it is. That blatant populist fascism is part of most of our psyches. When we see him saying bullshit to any intellectual or rational argument, there's something deep inside us that responds to that because there's some element of us that is fascist and populist. And in the same way, in The Removalist, in a good production of The Removalist, the audience laughs at the initial violence. They think Kenny Carter is a little upstart and he deserves a few punches in the gut. And it draws the audience into a position where they're identifying with the authoritarian, populist, fascist behaviour of the police. And in a good production, there's a turnover point where the audience has to say to itself, am I justified in laughing any longer? Isn't there a moral... And so that's part of the function of the play, to get the audience to the point where they have to decide for themselves how much of them they share with the sergeant who's beating Kenny Carter, as it turns out, literally almost to death.
Sure. But there's something really anarchic about comedy, isn't there? Because I can remember when I saw a production of The Removalist that on one side I had a friend who was gripping his umbrella from the beginning and you could see the whites of his knuckles in the darkness of the auditorium. He was absolutely horrified by the violence from the very beginning. And there was another woman sitting a few seats away who thought she was at ringside with the wrestlers and was rolling about in ecstasy throughout. So it must be terribly difficult. Obviously, it's a production problem in part, but it's also a corollary of comedy, isn't it? That it's very difficult to fix a line. If you choose to laugh at evil or what is ugly, there is always that risk that you're giving it a reassuring place somehow or other.
There's a risk, but finally you can't protect an audience from that risk. You've got to say to them, look, this play is telling you something. If you laugh too long and too loud, this play is telling you something about yourself. It's telling you that you share those, you're not a rational, liberal humanist. After all, you really share some of those deep id impulses of aggression and sexuality that you're seeing on stage. And this point was brought out. Harold Hobson wrote a scathing review of The Removalists, and he said, look, this is dreadful. I'm a moral man. This is like a bear pit. I go in and watch an audience enjoying violence. He was picked up by Walker in the International Herald Tribune, who pointed out that Harold was telling more about himself in that review than he was about the play. And I think that's legitimate. You've got to carry the audience to the point where they have to make the moral decision about what sort of people they are. And some of them are going to be shocked. We had productions of The Removalists, or the first production in Melbourne, when a member of the audience, admittedly I think he'd been smoking something stronger than cigarettes, leapt up, raced down and pleaded with the sergeant to stop hitting Kenny.
Really? Yeah.
We had to stop the production. Now, no production can guarantee you immunity from that very personal and very strong reaction to a play. No matter how the production is controlled, you're going to get a wide range of reactions in the audience, and that's part of the unpredictability of drama.
Yeah. Do you see any change in your recent plays, not only Sons of Cain, but looking back at The Perfectionist and Travelling North too, any change in the balance between humour and seriousness in your plays? Do you think that they're becoming less committed to the one-liner than they perhaps once were?
Well, I don't know. I never saw myself as doing one-liners. I thought the humour most often in the plays arose from the position I, as the writer, put myself in. I think the plays were always, the behaviour I wrote was always viewed slightly ironically, so that I was saying to the audience, look, aren't these people behaving rather stupidly? Or these are supposed to be grown men, for instance in the club, these are supposed to be grown men, and yet they're squabbling like children. I, as the writer, am saying to the audience, what do you think of this sort of behaviour? And the answer is the audience often thinks it's absurd and stupid that grown men should be behaving this way. There's not, if you look at the structure of, say, the club, there are not that many one-liners. Where the laughter mainly comes is from that ironic distancing of the audience seeing grown men behave like fools, and recognising something of this themselves in that, and recognising again that this vision we have of ourselves as rational, liberal, humanistic creatures is often wrong. We are creatures dominated by ego and id impulses, masquerading as rational and humanistic.
Are you conscious of any other developments or changes, needn't be called developments, in your work over the last 15 years?
Yes, I am. I'm growing older. I'm hopefully learning more about the human relationships around me. I'm maturing, I hope, and I hope that input is feeding into the play. So to answer, I didn't quite answer your question, but to answer your question, I think if there is anything happening, it's a growing level of complexity in the characterizations in the plays that's hopefully showing itself up. I mean, the Removalists can be a very powerful play, but it doesn't probe deeply into the psyches of particularly the women or the or indeed the males. They're pretty primitive creatures battling on a pretty primitive battleground. And I think, for instance, in Travelling North or The Perfectionist, maybe there are more complex human beings operating and exercising more of their rational minds and trying to disguise more cleverly their non-rational aspects.
Well, they've certainly become more articulate people, haven't they? And articulate in talking about themselves, which I suppose needn't make them more revealing. I wonder, well, that may be an explanation for a phenomenon that I've often wondered about, which is the disappearance of the ochre from your plays and from the Australian stage generally. He was the larrikin figure in the early 70s who was responsible for most of the humour, and he goes out of your plays, I think, in What If You Died Tomorrow, doesn't he, when Harry Bustle leaves the stage, unless Kevin brings him back recently in Sons of Cain to some extent. But that character seems largely to have gone, and perhaps is that because he's so much a disguised and stereotypical human being, you don't really get a sense of what's behind the ochre mask because you're so preoccupied with his mannerisms. Is that?
Yes, I think we took great delight in seeing these monsters early on in the 70s, but I think it could also be that having seen the ochre on stage, a lot of ochres have modified their behaviour. I mean, art can feed back into life in that way. You don't find too many coolies around now who were educated lads from a lower middle class background usually, who were affecting a working class style and mannerism as an affectation. I mean, they didn't need to swear as much as they did. No. They didn't need to be as rough and coarse as they were, but it was almost a fashionable style of the early 70s amongst the middle class who'd gone to universities. That style has disappeared, and maybe it's partly that because you no longer see them around that they've disappeared from the work.
Yeah, I really thought that they came into being much more after Don's Party, actually, for a few years, but that was partly because the figure was being presented on stage, and suddenly there were badges that you could wear, which signified you as that sort of character.
Yes, it could have worked both ways, yeah.
What are there any other formal changes? One of the obvious things, I suppose, about your recent writing for the stage is that scripts have become more episodic. Is that a response to writing for film? And how do you see that as affecting the nature of your work?
Well, I've seen that the possibilities of stage now have been opened up because so many pressures are there to emulate the sudden, swift cuts of film. The technologies of design have improved so that set changes are not nearly as ponderous, and that sets are designed to cope with really rapid scene changes. So A, there's the possibility that it can be done very easily and very effectively now, and B, I think sometimes the episodic form suits the particular material being used or being written about. For instance, in Travelling North, if you're looking at the progress of a relationship over 3 years, it seems logical to show the development of that relationship, whereas in the club or in the department where I was primarily interested in investigating the power plays and the way language was used as a tool in those power plays, then it seemed logical to compress the play into an ongoing unities situation, a committee meeting, a party, or a negotiation prior to a committee meeting, as in the club.
Yeah.
Because what I was interested in looking at was the way the political process and social processes were conducted. Whereas in Travelling North, I'm looking at the growth of a relationship. In Perfectionist, I'm looking at the change in a relationship that's spurred by the wife demanding a renegotiation in the marriage. So if I was to use just an ongoing 2-hour slice of time situation, then I'd have to resort to an incredible amount of exposition about events that had happened before the play actually started.
So that episodic framework then you'd see as more sympathetic to psychological exploration of the characters.
Yeah, yes, I do. Because you can see development over time.
Yeah. Your early plays were, for want of a better word, naturalistic, and perhaps I'll get you to define your sense of that word, because in a couple of the articles that you wrote about your work in the early 70s, you talked about the need for a closely naturalistic production of your plays. Looking back then now, do you find that form as limited as it was popularly thought to be? I remember you arguing very strongly that it wasn't.
Well, there are so many variants of naturalism. I mean, the old Ibsen type naturalism, where so much exposition about characters' backgrounds and etc. was stuffed into the text that it could scarcely be called naturalism under any modern scrutiny, because people said things in Ibsen plays that they would never have actually said in life in order to get all the exposition in. So it was very difficult for me to define what naturalism was. I suppose the only definition is that people come into the theatre and watch what the author purports to be real-life processes. But as I say, I always felt that the plays had a distancing irony to them, that they weren't without author's comment about the types of behaviour that were being shown on stage. And I often used to describe the early work as on the borderland between naturalism and satire, and I just think I was trying to say that they were in some cases ironic, or ironic distancing was taking place. No, I'm interested. I am interested in interaction processes, and always have been, because after engineering I studied psychology and gravitated into the fields of areas of social psychology, so I was always intensely interested in the way people use language to interact, and the power processes and manipulations that were involved. So for me, and my particular area of interest, symbolism or whatever didn't interest me, because it didn't hone into the area of investigation that I wanted to get into.
Yeah, but that pattern then you'd see as changing now. It's interesting that, I mean, by the criterion of naturalism that you've been using, perhaps your present plays are as naturalistic in that sense. It's simply that they're fragmented, but they're not fixed set naturalism. They're not that sort of closely observed group of people under a microscope for a specified period. But they're still, the plays in fact are still representing a naturalistic view of social behaviour.
Oh yeah, except that if a naturalistic view means a liberal, humanist, rational view, as I've pointed out, I do take pains to show that there is a Freudian id underneath there, that a lot of that so-called rational behaviour is really only a mask for egocentric and unconsciously motivated, egocentric and aggressive behaviour. I don't know whether that falls within the ambit of naturalism. I've never had a satisfactory definition in my own mind of what naturalism is.
Just to switch tack altogether, which of your plays do you see as your favourites, and why?
Well, the ones I like the most, in retrospect, are Removalist Don's Party, Department, Travelling North, Perfectionist, and Sons of Cain. The rest I have doubts and worries about. Handful of Friends, I'm never quite sure. I'm sure that Jugglers 3 was an inferior bit of work, as I'm sure that Celluloid Heroes was. I'm sure that What If You Died Tomorrow could have been a lot better, and that The Coming of Stork was exuberant but lacked a little bit of finesse. Yeah.
In your list, I was trying to make some connections toward a theory, which would lead me into the next thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is the nature of self-reference in your work, because a couple of those plays that you designated were plays that particularly seemed to have a definable relation to your own life, and a number of the plays that you mentioned among your favourite list were plays that clearly didn't have that sort of direct relationship, although they often are, as you've explained elsewhere, grounded in an anecdote that you've been told or in someone that you knew. Do you see that quality of self-reference as a problem in your plays, and are you conscious of trying to control it?
No. See, some of my favourite plays are Perfectionist, which has got a lot of self-reference in,
yeah.
And Department, which has got a lot of self-reference in too. I actually lived through a department situation for 7 years. Now, I don't think that's the fundamental problem. I think I just made serious structural mistakes. For instance, in Jugglers 3, I ran out of dramatic steam. I should have kept exploring the marital situation and the change in marital situation, but I didn't. I brought in an extraneous character to carry the action along, a working-class character called Dennis, who was farcical, and turned it into a farce. Maybe I brought that character in because I wanted to avoid exploration in depth. Maybe I brought Harry Bustle in because I wanted to avoid exploration in depth. That's a possibility. But I didn't want to avoid exploration in some depth in Perfectionist or in Department. I think that maybe, perhaps as I've got older, I'm prepared to look inside myself and look at that Freudian id and be a bit more honest, hopefully. So I don't feel that that's necessarily true, that that I've introduced structural distortions because I couldn't face myself. Maybe. There's an element of that. There's certainly Andrew in What If You Died Tomorrow is underdrawn, and the academic in Jugglers 3 is underdrawn.
Yeah. That, from the perspective then of your current interest, I wonder what you make of those early criticisms about the lack of psychological roundedness in your characters, the fact that they weren't often very clearly motivated and that they tended to be representative, stereotypical characters. Do you see that as an inadequacy, or do you see that as warranted in the context of those plays, since obviously that's a mode that you've partly moved away from?
Well, in the introduction to Removalists, I stated on the cover of the first typewritten version of the play that these characters behave according to rigid roles. It is only rarely that they break out of those rigid roles and express the depths that are going on underneath. So I was consciously writing the play in terms of stereotypes, and occasionally the stereotype slips. When it gets too much for the sergeant, when his sexual identity and prowess are threatened, he finally becomes the irrational creature that we've always suspected he'll be. So, I was consciously writing stereotypes, and stereotypes are part and parcel of drama. You've got 2 hours on stage, you've got a certain number of characters. You can't show the infinite facets of a human being in 2 hours. I think if you look at King Lear, there are very heavy stereotypes all through that play. I mean, Edgar's the bad guy, and Edmund, is it Edgar the bad guy?
Other way around.
Oh, yeah, well, Edgar's the good guy, and Edmund's the bad guy. They never change from the minute they get on stage. One's the epitome of all evil, one's the epitome of all good. It's part and parcel of drama. If you are going to overcome... drama is partly a matter of information release. How do you get it out? And if you're writing in a naturalistic mode, you can only let the information come out largely through the words that are spoken by the characters. You've got 2 hours with 6 of them on stage. They can't reveal their inner depths unless you move to other modes, which I'm starting to do, perhaps in response to a pressure for more detail about my characters. I started in Perfectionist giving Barbara a voice to the audience, which would contrast with the naturalistic voice that came out of her mouth in dramatic interaction. In my latest play, Emerald City, I've extended the process and given a dramatic, straight-to-the-voice audience to my 4 principal characters. So they give the audience their point of view over and above the point of view expressed through their dialogue in an attempt to broaden the complexity of the characters that I'm dealing with on stage. So I've been feeling the strain for some years, and I started to feel the strain in Perfectionist, of wanting an internal monologue, which, Shakespeare did so easily when Hamlet walks to the front of the stage and says, to be or not to be, am I going to kill him or am I not? So I'm starting to do it, and perhaps that's a response to a pressure for more detail.
It sounds like, too, perhaps a change in your approach to the understanding of the psychology of the characters, because there's a strong sense in most of your earlier plays of people being the creatures of their social roles, isn't there? And even into The Perfectionist, it's intensely embarrassing for anybody who's ever been in a marital argument, because you're there, you recognise that you're going through the same mannerisms, and the next time you use them, you feel doubly embarrassed. And there is the sense that we are all socially conditioned creatures who have at most a conjectural sort of reality, if any at all. It sounds as though you're moving now toward a mode which suggests that there is there is a layer of self which is quite distinct from those social levels. Is that so? When you talk about the id, is that the kind of thing you're moving toward? Well,
there's a simple level of internal monologue that's not available in social discourse. We in the old sense, we think a lot of things in our head that never come out our mouth, and the novelist has always had that facility to give us that inner monologue and enrich his characters, because he's got one further avenue of information release about his characters. In a way, all works about human beings are exercises in information theory, which I used to study as an engineer, of how you get the information out most succinctly and most effectively to the audience. Well, a novelist has always had that interior monologue. I'm starting to feel that pressure that I'd like the same, like some of the same freedom to reveal more of my characters that a novelist has. Hence, in Emerald City, I'm giving those characters a voice to the audience. They assume, all the characters assume the audience share their point of view. They've got vastly different points of view, but the audience probably doesn't. But it's a way of amplifying what they actually say to each other and counterpointing what they say to each other in social discourse.
This is a matter of interest. What's the balance of the sexes in Emerald City?
Well, to the principal characters, 2 male, 2 female, a married couple on one hand and a man and a woman living together on the other.
I ask that because obviously the limitations of self-revelation in some of the earlier plays are probably directly related to the fact that they're male rituals that you're investigating primarily, aren't they? And women characters have emerged much more strongly, I think, in your recent plays. Barbara in The Perfectionist and even Frances in Travelling North are both characters whose motivation we're very interested in. We may not be able to get very far often in understanding why they do certain things, but we're certainly led to ask about them, aren't we? In ways that we weren't about the earlier women in your plays, I think.
Yes, because so many of the early plays did deal with male power games, competitive male power games and competitive male rituals. I was showing the social mask a lot of the times, and the social mask in those power games for males is much more highly developed and much more obvious than for females. I mean, power games have for so long been the province of men that the female characters played somewhat of a secondary role. Even in Don's Party, it was the males who put on the competitive and ritualistic displays. The females, occasionally when the mask dropped, showed the inner distress, but they didn't have theatrical roles to play. And I think that Germaine Greer once said that the only role left for a woman to play in a social situation like a party is that role of neurotic breakdown and great distress. Finally, when she's had enough, she'll throw a tantrum or do something outrageous, but there wasn't a defined role for women in those sorts of social situations.
Do you see that as the source of a lot of the dissatisfaction that people expressed? One of the early criticisms of your plays was the characterisation of the women, Fiona and Kate and the Removalists and the 5 women in Don's Party. Is it the problem that there was no interesting stereotype to refer to in that context, where for the men there was always the kind of raconteur style, wasn't there?
Yes, there was, and I think that I did touch on 2 very common Australian female stereotypes in Removalists. I mean, the upwardly mobile social bitch and the feckless, manipulated...
Barefoot and pregnant.
Yeah, barefoot and pregnant. I think that I actually observed that role being played so many times. I mean, I observed the sharp-tongued, caustic bitch role in my youth growing up. All the women in our extended family seemed to be of that sort. So I thought it was truthful, and but it because we never saw the women other than playing those social roles, one could legitimately claim, if they were looking for deep exploration of female psyches, that it didn't appear in the plays, but it was never meant to appear. I mean, the plays were not about that. Whereas some of the later plays I've been writing have been more concerned with a broader range and what's really going on under the social mask. About the well springs of human motivation are a difficult one for dramatists. I think any dramatist who tries to fully explain their characters is in big trouble. I think my first year as a psychology student, we had a textbook called Hall and Lindsay, which said the 56 current theories of personality. And they're all totally self-contradictory. I mean, anyone who thinks that they can understand and explain human behaviour in all its complexities is fooling themselves, and any dramatist who thinks he can is also fooling themselves. So to some extent you've got to take human nature as given. There are some wild extroverts, there are some deep introverts. It may not necessarily be because one had bad toilet training and another didn't. There may be a biological basis to that difference which we simply can't explain dramatically.
How far in The Perfectionist are you trying to account for Stuart? I was struck by the fact that in that play we hear a good deal, and we see, of course, a good deal about Stuart's family background as an influence on his present perfectionism. And at the end of the play, Barbara speculates on whether she might be the perfectionist. But we don't really hear anything about Barbara's background at all, do we? That comes rather out of the blue. But there does seem to be some attempt to give us some information about Stuart which is relevant to our judgment of him. Is that part of... I mean, is that intended as a legitimate kind of psychologising, or is it a bit of a red herring?
Yes, I do think that there are cases when adult behaviour, can be partly explained in terms of environmental causes, what has happened to that person earlier in life. I think Barbara, the only time she mentions her family background, she says, my background was so free of traumas, I should be the best adjusted person in the world. Perhaps I'm trying to suggest there that her account is probably true. She had no deeply traumatic incidents to explain her obsessiveness or her streak of obsessiveness, and that may be true. The streak of obsessiveness may, in fact, have biological roots. Who knows? But I was saying that in Stuart's case, it is possible that parents who only pay attention to their kids when their kids have done something special, like get good marks at school, are encouraging a certain pattern of behaviour that makes the kid forever in his life from then on strive for good marks in school so that people will notice him. So yes, I was positing that there were environmental causes for his behaviour, but suggesting, without exploring, that Barbara's behaviour may be unaccountable for in those sort of terms.
Yeah, and you actually, now that I think of it, you left open a degree of ambiguity with Stuart too, in that although, well, at least his own pattern might have been clear, but he's given a brother, the unseen Alan, who's in fact dropped out in response to exactly the same pattern of stimuli, hasn't he?
Yes, so you can't guarantee that any particular type of upbringing or environmental event will produce the same effect in all individuals. It depends on their basic temperament, yeah.
Were you conscious with the female characters who have emerged more strongly in your recent plays of making a sort of conscious reparation for that essentially male preoccupation of the earlier plays?
No, I wasn't. But I did think that I do think that I've got to know if there is an average difference in the female psyche. Perhaps I've got to know a little more about it as I've got older, and I've lived in close conjunction with it for many years, so that I do feel slightly more confident about writing about it. But it's also the subject matter of the plays, because they do delve a little bit more fully under that social mask. I'm required to say more about the characters, although, as you rightly pick up, I didn't say as much about Barbara's background as I did about Stuart's, so perhaps there is an unconscious imbalance there. Perhaps I know or feel I know male behaviour so thoroughly, because I am one, that I'm more confident writing about it.
Mm. Just in conclusion, David, I wonder if you could tell us a little about Emerald City and the kinds of things that it's concerned with.
Yes, it's about a screenwriter. It's, again, one has to say that people will assume that I'm writing from experience, because it's about a screenwriter who moves from Melbourne to Sydney and moves from a city that is characterised loosely as being a fairly moral, upright city, where moral values are held to be of some importance, and where moral debate and political debate is held to be something that should take place and does take place, to a city where it's commonly held that hedonism reigns supreme, where nobody wastes time debating morals or politics. One sets about making a lot of money so one can buy a waterfront place and enjoy the marvellous sunny hedonistic lifestyle. And in fact, there are some realities behind that stereotype of the two cities. There was a recent poll done which showed that on questions like tax cheating, twice as many people in Sydney thought it was legitimate to cheat the taxman as those did in Melbourne. So there is some basis to the stereotype, and as a background, I'm trying to draw on that difference and have a look at what happens to my characters when they migrate from Melbourne to Sydney. The screenwriter comes into contact with a character who he is amazed at. He calls him, it's like a zoologist finding a new species, a poor Jackson huckster who has no moral values apparently whatsoever, and it's the mutual fascination of these two characters and their wives or their partners that form the basis of the drama.
Well, we'll all look forward to it very much. David Williamson, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Peter.